Well, good evening and welcome to a new season of Florida Conversations. I'm CJ Roberts, the Frankie Duckwall, President and CEO of the Tampa Bay History Center. As many of you know, Florida Conversations is a program series hosted in partnership with the University of South Florida Libraries with media sponsorship provided by WSF Public Media. As with all of our museums and home programs this year, we're grateful to our friends at Raymond James for their sponsorship during this challenging time, as it has enabled us to continue to fulfill our mission and share important stories. And we're making history tonight. We've never offered this series digitally. And while we hope to resume in-person programs sometime in the near future, who knows when, for now, we think it's best to offer this type of content electronically. We ask for your patience and your input as we work to figure out what works and what doesn't in presenting these lectures over the internet. So if you have suggestions or ideas, please leave those in the comments section. Tonight's kickoff presentation is particularly special as our guest is a longtime TBHC friend and former board member. Without her support during her time as mayor 11 years ago, the Tampa Bay History Center would not have opened in its current location. So thank you, Pam. We'll always be grateful to you. And we just think this location keeps getting better and better. Now, to provide her formal introduction and to introduce tonight's presentation, I'm pleased to turn the program over to Rodney Kite-Powell, TBHC's Director of the Touchton Map Library and our Center for Cartographic Education. Rodney?
Thank you so much, CJ, and thank you all for joining in, both those who are here live and those watching later. It is our absolute pleasure to have as our first Florida Conversations guest for the kind of 2020-2021 season, former Mayor Pam Iorio. She's currently the President CEO of Proposed Big Sisters and is a fantastic advocate for history and for children. But she has a really distinguished past in politics and particular experience in elections. And so with an election just less than 50 days away, we thought it would be good to talk to Pam about her time in public office, but also particularly her time as the Supervisor of Elections for Hillsborough County. So Pam, the kind of get to know you question, people maybe don't know this little bit of trivia, but when you were elected to the Hillsborough County Board of County Commissioners in the mid-1980s, you were the youngest person to ever be elected to that board. What drove you to enter politics here in Hillsborough County?
Well, thank you, Rodney, and hello to you, hello to you, CJ, and to everyone who's tuning into this conversation. Yeah, that seems like a long time ago, doesn't it, Rodney, when you're talking about the election of 1984, which turned into the election of 1985 because the election for county commission got delayed because the new charter had not been approved by the Justice Department. So that's a little piece of historical trivia, is that the first time that I ran for office and was elected to the county commission, the election was actually canceled and had to be scheduled for the spring of 1985. Rodney, I'd always wanted to serve in public life. I've always had a lot of interest in American history and in politics. And when I left college, graduated from college and returned home to Tampa, you might recall that history, which was that at that time there was a 5-member board of county commissioners, and they were all elected at large, meaning they were all elected countywide. And 3 of the 5, one day, they were arrested for taking bribes. And so the FBI escorted 3 of the 5 commissioners out of the courthouse. They didn't even have a quorum. Mm-hmm. And Governor Graham at the time had to step in and actually bring in Mr. Redmond from Plant City to act as a temporary county commissioner to provide for a quorum. Mm-hmm. So the county really reeled because, here there had been a great deal of corruption in our county for a long time with people, with commissioners, voting a certain way on rezonings because of bribes. Mm-hmm. So just a terrible, scenario for any local community to have that happen. And so there was a big push to change the charter and to have, instead of 5 at large, to have 3 at large and 4 individuals running single member districts.
Mhm.
And I was just out of college. I had graduated from the American University. I'd come home, got involved politically, worked on some campaigns, and so I worked on that charter campaign. And so then once the charter passed, now there were these races where there were 4 single members. So, single member districts do allow for, when you don't have to run from an entire county-wide perspective, it's not quite as daunting when the county's divided into 4ths. And so I'll never forget this story. My dad and I, we went to one of the candidate forums for County Commission District 2. And the various candidates got up there to give their viewpoint. And District 2 at that time was Carrollwood, Lutz, Keystone, Temple Terrace. Tampa Palms had not even been built at that time. And we listened to each of the candidates get up and give their spiel. And my dad turned to me and he said, why aren't you up there? Why aren't you running? And I said, well, Dad, I can think of a lot of reasons why. I just graduated from college. There's a whole list of reasons why I shouldn't be running. And he said, you should run. You should be one of those people running. And, my dad believed in me. Others believed in me. I had a wonderful mentor and still one of my dearest friends, Fran Davin. And she had just left the county commission after 2 very successful terms in office. And so I ran, and it seemed implausible at the time, but we ran a very spirited grassroots campaign. And, I actually think it's one of those interesting times in local history where the fact that I was so young and so inexperienced was really probably to my benefit, because the voters looked at the so-called experience of the people who had been there for a lot of years. They were experienced in taking bribes. They were experienced in all the wrong things. And so the voters gave me a chance back then, and I'll never forget it. And I always vowed when the voters gave me a chance to serve, not to let the voters down, because they did take a chance on me. I truly, anytime anyone runs, they always say, vote for me. I'm the most experienced, but truly at age 25, you don't really have that experience or much experience.
Yeah. And you mentioned your good friend Davin. The late 70s and early 80s saw a lot of women finally not just running, but successfully running for office, both Tampa City Council and the County Commission. What was going on at that time that women were finally seeing success in the political arena?
So yes, these are the real pioneers. So when we talk about the women in Hillsborough County who blazed the trail, I'm not one of them, because I came in that second wave in the 1980s. The women who really blazed the trail were Fran Davin, Betty Castor, Helen Gordon Davis. What you had in the early 1970s was a real concern about the environment and real concern about the unbridled growth that was happening in the unincorporated part of the county, where there didn't seem to be any rhyme or reason to the decisions that were being made. And the League of Women Voters at that time was a very potent force. You had some extraordinarily talented women as presidents, or serving as officers in the League of Women Voters. And so, at some point, just like when my dad turned to me and said, why don't you run? I think they looked at each other in the early 1970s and said, why aren't we running? Why aren't we on the Hillsborough County Commission? So the first one was in 1972 when Betty Castor became the first elected woman to the Hillsborough County Commission. She was followed 2 years later by Fran Davin, and then later by Jan Platt. And then you had Sandy Friedman run on City Council. You had Helen Gordon Davis in the State House. Most of these women really found their base of support in the League of Women Voters. They also pioneered something that was very new to politics, and that was canvassing, door-to-door canvassing. Prior to the cast of Betty's election in 1972, elections, you didn't really have precinct walking. You didn't have folks knocking on a door and saying, here, I'm here for Betty Castor. I would appreciate your vote. You know, it was a lot of the rallies and the fried chicken picnic and the things where you went and you met the candidate. But really, Betty and the group of women who made up the League of Women Voters in the early 70s, they were very smart, and they actually targeted voters and walked door to door. And, you know, today people listen to that, they say, oh yeah, walking door to door, everyone does it. Well, everyone didn't do it. And so they really pioneered that technique of walking door to door and getting votes that way, because people actually got to either meet the candidate or they got to meet a supporter. So those women will always, I think, should be noted for their pioneering efforts, because not only did they run and get elected, but when they got elected, they did a great job. Mm-hmm. And so, you know, when you're following in the footsteps of Betty Castor and Fran Davin, you know, it's easier for the voters to accept you as a young woman running in the 1980s, because they look at that track record and they say, wow, these are exemplary public officials, very honest, very committed, very engaged on issues, very progressive. And that made a lot of difference to our community.
It's really incredible to see, again, that first wave that when you kind of surfed on to come in as that second group. It's really amazing the amount of change that happened during that time as well. As I ask you questions, I want to remind those who are viewing this live that they can also ask questions, and we'll get those questions to Pam. So I think you use the Q&A function of the webinar, and you can ask questions, and we'll be happy to answer them. And as if anybody folks are formulating their own questions, my next one for you is, so you had a successful time on the Board of County Commissioners, but you decided to run for Supervisor of Elections, and you were successful in that. What prompted you to go from the legislature, so to speak, but to a position where I guess you have to make a difference, but in a different way?
Yeah, in 1992, after I served 2 terms on the county commission, I ran for Supervisor of Elections. I followed Robin Kervanik, who had, she also was one of the pioneering women I've neglected to mention, elected again in the 1970s, first woman elected in that kind of an executive position. You know, what really drove, my life changed. I got married while I was on the county commission, and Mark and I had 2 children, have 2 children, Caitlin and Graham. Now we're grandparents. And so Caitlin was born in '88 and Graham in 1990. And, you know, when I was trying to decide on my next steps, I really wanted to continue to serve, but I didn't want to serve in a capacity that took me away from my family. And so I settled, I thought, well, the Supervisor of Elections, there's a lot that could be done with that. Voting is nothing more important than the vote. You know, when I decided to run for Supervisor of Elections, people thought that I had entered the Federal Witness Protection Program. You know, they were like, that is the most dead-end job in the whole world. It's ministerial. No one will ever hear from you again. And you know, I guess it just goes to show you just have to, sometimes you go into a direction and you're not sure where it's going to take you, but it was the best thing that I could have possibly have done to be Supervisor of Elections. Not only did I just gain a fantastic appreciation for the right to vote, it prompted me to go back to school and get my master's in history so I could study the history of voting. And that led me to think about whether or not I should run for mayor. And then, of course, came the 2000 election debacle of Bush versus Gore, where the Chads hit the fan. And
we'll talk about that.
You know, I mean, you could never imagine that in 1992, when I thought about running for Supervisor of Elections, you wouldn't, you know, none of that was in the picture, but that's life. Life's unusual in that way.
Exactly. So for those who don't know, what is the role of the Supervisor of Elections and the elections office in Hillsborough County?
So, and I think it's always important for people to think about this when there's a lot of talk today about elections and whether elections are going to be honest. You know, elections are local. All elections are locally managed. And so in the state of Florida, they happen to be locally managed by 67 independent supervisors of elections who are all elected, except in Miami-Dade, that individual is appointed. And the supervisor of elections job is to run elections and do it the right way, and also to maintain the voter registration rolls. And so when we talk about, you know, we tend to talk about, oh, I'm concerned about the upcoming election in this country, or is this going to be done right? Is that going to be done right? I always think it's important to remember that in our country, elections are a local affair. It's really up to your individual community as to whether or not it's going to be a well-run election. You might have the best election and well-run election in the whole country in Hillsborough County, but over in the next county, there could be issues. And so, you know, I have found, and I spent 10 years as a supervisor of elections, and, you know, in Florida, very diligent people, very honest. They try very hard to be nonpartisan, and you know, really just focused on upholding the law and doing the right thing.
Mm-hmm. And yeah, yes, incredibly important, obviously. So you'd mentioned the 2000 election, and we're going to get to that in a little bit. But you also mentioned your interest in history, and so that's, you know, one thing that that Tampa has in particular is a history of interesting elections, to kind of put it mildly. One of the most infamous of all the elections in Tampa's history was the 1935 mayoral race. Take us back to 1935 and tell us what was going on then, and are there any lessons that we can learn from that?
Okay, I mean, picture the scene. First of all, elections in Tampa were always raucous affairs, you know. Poll workers, heads cracked at polling places, ballot stuffing. I would say in the first half of the 20th century, there was never an honest election in the city of Tampa. And of course, when you got to the mayor's race, the stakes were really high because, I mean, just think about it, 1935, the mayor controls all the city jobs, right? It's all about patronage. And so whoever's in the mayor's office is all about having a job and control. And so everything's, you know, a big deal. So now let's go back to Labor Day weekend in 1935. You have this bitter, bitter race between the incumbent, Robert E. Lee Chauncey, the incumbent mayor, and D.B. McKay, who is trying for his 5th term as mayor of Tampa. Bitter, lodging all kinds of insults and complaints about one another. I mean, even a week before the election, the city council has to tries to pass a resolution asking people, saying that it would be illegal to buy shotguns and certain kinds of armory with silencers connected to them because they were afraid they would be used on election day. Mm-hmm. Meanwhile, on that Labor Day weekend, here comes a devastating hurricane that, if people recall from history, absolutely flattened the Florida Keys. Terrible loss of life in the Florida Keys. And so it was rounding the bend out into the Gulf. And by the time Election Day came along, in addition to, you know, the stuffing of the ballot boxes and poll workers who were literally being arrested on Election Day and removed from their posts, the National Guard had been called in because of the hurricane. There were 65-mile-an-hour winds. People were waiting in line to vote, and here are these hurricane force winds, water, constant rain, and now you have this hotly contested election. And the National Guard was there for the hurricane, but as long as they were there for the hurricane, they also got involved in what was happening at the polls because, you know, violence at the polls was commonplace. Well, after the dust cleared from the storm and from Election Day, Robert E. Lee Chauncey won re-election. Whether he truly won, who knows, because it was not an honest count. they rarely had an honest election in Tampa during that time frame. But this one was reported in the New York Times. And in the New York Times, there were headlines about how heads were cracked on election day, poll workers removed from their posts in the middle of the day, ballot boxes being openly stuffed. And so these were the headlines. And for the first time, I think it jolted the city fathers. There was only the fathers at that time who were in charge, to say, this doesn't reflect well on our community. We're trying to be seen as this, growing progressive city here that is a place to come and do business. And the national headlines are about elections that is, it's just unbelievably bad by anyone's standards. At that time, there had been a supervisor of registration, not of elections, but just of registration, by the name of John Deacle. And he had only been in the job for a few years. He was a very honest person. And that election actually led to reforms. For the first time, I think the Civitan Club folks got together and they said, look, this whole paper ballot business, the stuffing of the ballot box, it's got to end. No one has any faith in our election system anymore. And not only that, but it's becoming very violent. And so John Deacle, working with the Civitan Club, ushered in the old voting machines. Remember the shoot voting machines? Well, that was a scandal for another day. But at the time, the voting machines were seen to be superior, that you couldn't stuff the ballot box. And so actually Hillsborough County was the first county in the state of Florida to adopt the voting machine and move off of the paper ballot. And that was because our elections had reached such a low point, it was such a cesspool that it was nationally recognized as such, that it really prompted that kind of reform.
Yeah. And you mentioned the violence. The amazing thing to me is you had, of course, Mayor Chancey, who controlled the city police because he was the mayor at the time. But former Mayor McKay, because of his family alliances and other political alliances, had the sheriff's office. And so it literally had Hillsborough County sheriff's deputies battling city of Tampa police officers at these polling stations. And it really, certainly we deserved any ridicule or any derision that we saw from national media, because it was really, it laid bare the problems of the corruption that Tampa had at that time.
It absolutely did. And the other thing that's not a proud part of our history is that, and this was led by D.B. McKay in 1908, and that was the creation of Tampa's White Municipal Party.
Yes.
So when you look back in history, municipal elections were nonpartisan elections. So blacks were already prevented from joining the Democratic Party. But when you had your mayor and city council races, just like when I was elected, we were not elected by party. It's no party. And so people at that time, not just in Tampa, but other southern cities, devised a way to prohibit black voters from participating in municipal elections. And their remedy was the creation of a new party called the White Municipal Party. And of course, to belong to that, you had to be white. And it was the White Municipal Party that ran Tampa's city elections all the way until the early 1950s. So when you talk about, a systemic issue of something that deprived a group of people in Tampa from participating in the electoral process and having a say in who their mayor is going to be and who their city council members are going to be, the creation of Tampa's White Municipal Party was the mechanism that was used to prevent that participation.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. And so the white primary, as the larger structure of that throughout the South, did the same thing. And so because there was you had still the primary system of Democrats and Republicans running in primaries, but if you have this white party, then you take that primary system away. And so when you have this white primary, the only white people can vote in because they ostensibly, it's their party, so to speak. Once you get to a general election, there's hardly a need to even hold that general election. There aren't enough people to oppose that white party candidate that was elected in the white primary. And you read the papers, and even though it was a primary election and there was still going to be a general election, be it for the mayor or for governor, they knew and they wrote about, so-and-so was elected to that position, even though they weren't officially elected yet, because there was still a general election to go through. But that's just how the system worked at the time. And I think it was 1947 maybe in Texas, a Texas decision or a Supreme Court decision of a Texas case that finally outlawed the white primary. It
did. It was Smith versus Allwright, which the Supreme Court ruled on, and they said that that a party primary was not a private affair. So you could not exclude an entire group of people from your primary because it served this public purpose. And so that was the Supreme Court ruling, and then that meant that the Democratic Party had to allow Black voters, but still the white municipal party did not actually go away right away. I mean, it should have gone away right then at that ruling, but it really didn't go away until I think it was 1951 or 1952. And that is, that is really a stain on our local history. And one that I don't think should be forgotten, because often when we're talking about what are some of the systemic issues, in history that have led to issues that perhaps we confront today, you have to say that by excluding an entire group of city residents from participating in the municipal elections for half a century, that has a particular impact on your community.
Yeah, and I mean, we can kind of go on with in that vein, but just, to point out that even though, again, as you just like segregation, where the Brown decision did not end segregation at that point in time,
right?
Rightly point out that the white party existed for another maybe 5 years or so, but you also have just a generation that has to get up to speed to even run for office, and even be able to vote and feel safe voting. So the lag for all of that, first women were elected in local office in the 70s, but it wasn't until the 1980s that the first African Americans were elected to local office since Reconstruction.
That's correct.
So that you can just see with the after effect of that system, really took a long time to go through, and you could arguably say we're still going through it at this point.
Right.
So now, kind of what people have been waiting for. Behind me, you might recognize. I don't know how the system works here. If I'm talking, you can see or not. But so behind me, on display here on the third floor of the History Center, is a Votomatic voting machine that was used in 2000 election, donated or actually probably transferred, I guess more technically, from the Supervisor's office by then Supervisor Pam Iorio to the History Center. We also have a ballot that was not used at the time because it was a spare ballot, and a bag of Chad. I guess the plural and singular of Chad is Chad. So 20 years ago, it's been a long time now. Take us, you took us back to 1935. Take us back to the year 2000.
Right.
And
now this time, I actually remember. The 1935 I only read about.
Yeah. And again, and I know you'll point this out, but it wasn't just the Chad problems that Florida had. And I think you're pointing out that every county has their own supervisor. Every county doesn't have their own system, but it's up to them, to decide what voting system works for them. And so that also maybe led to some problems in South Florida that we didn't have here.
So let's set the stage for the 2000 election, Bush versus Gore. But the Florida ballot, and the law is still this way, which I think desperately needs to be changed. And for some reason, it's never been changed. One is that it's very easy for minor party candidates to get on the ballot in Florida. Secondly, Florida, for some inexplicable reason, and if there's any legislator out there listening, please change this one day. You can have a write-in candidate for president. Now that makes absolutely no sense. Why would you have a write-in candidate for president? If you need 270 electoral votes, you have to be on the ballot in all 50 states. It doesn't make any sense. But that's Florida election law. So to set the stage for 2000, you have to bear in mind that there were 10 candidates for president. Yes, you had your Republican, Democrat, Libertarian, but you also had, your vegetarian. You had everyone, whoever, they all kinds of parties, right? You had people making up all kinds of parties, and they and their running mates were on the ballot. And you had to have a space for a write-in. So, this is just bad planning and philosophy out of the gate. You should not have all those people running for president unless they're going to be on the ballot in all 50 states and actually have a chance. So you had a record number of people running for president. And in Florida, there were two basic types of systems. One is the famous Votomatic, which had come in the 1970s to replace the voting machines replacing the paper ballot from that 35 election. And some people had an optical scan system. So there were some counties that actually had the bubble it in, right, like we do today, and feed it in the machine. So some did have that. But in all of the major counties, Pinellas and Hillsborough, Miami, Broward, Palm Beach, Dade, all the big counties, they all had the Votomatic. So the question was, how do you design the ballot? Because of all the candidates. Now, interestingly, because Hillsborough County was a voting rights county, meaning we fell under the Voting Rights Act, we had to have our ballots in both English and in Spanish. Consequently, we had very little sway. We didn't have a lot that we could do with our ballot design. It had to be pretty straightforward because you had to have English, Spanish, and so we just crammed them all on one page. But some of my colleagues across the state that did not have the Spanish requirement did different things. Okay, so in Duval County, he spread the candidates out over 2 pages. So like there were 7 candidates on one page, and then you turn the page and there were 3 more candidates, and then at the end, write-in. In Palm Beach County, she created what is now known as the butterfly ballot. And she put one name here and one name there and one name here. She crisscrossed it like that. So because there was no law that said that the ballot design had to be standardized, each supervisor, and I think no one had ill will or ill intent. It's just that they did something that they thought made sense for their voters, and they designed their ballot the ways that they did. So, and then in the optical scan counties, you had a number of people who they put a certain number of names in one column, and then they continued it over into the next column. So the genesis of the whole problem with that election began with the record number of candidates running for president that were allowed on the Florida ballot. So on election day, the Chads did hit the fan, and the first problems were noted in Palm Beach County because people thought that they were voting for Gore, but they were actually voting for Pat Buchanan. And so 14,000 votes were miscast that day. But, upon a further examination, there were a lot of problems. And in total, out of an election that was won by 537 votes, there were 113,000 ballots where a voter made an error by voting more than once. That's called overvoting. And here's why they voted more than once. In Duval County, there were 26,000 examples of this, where a voter voted for Gore on the first page, then flipped the book, saw 3 other names, hadn't heard of any of those names before, because again, they were just people, out of the blue saying, I'm just going to run for president. And then they would say, okay, well, this must be another race. And they would vote for one of them, and that negated their vote for Gore. In optical scan counties, same thing happened. And where at the bottom of the ballot it said write-in, thousands of voters, even up in the Panhandle where they had this optical scan, would vote for Gore and then write in Gore's name to further emphasize their vote for him. And that vote was negated. So this was probably the first election where the margin of error exceeded the margin of victory by a long shot. When you have someone elected president by 537 votes, but 113,000 votes did not count, largely because of ballot design issues in individual counties, you've got a problem. And that election highlighted a huge problem, the biggest problem being lack of uniformity in ballot design across the state. Too many people allowed to run for president. Still the case, stats should be changed. That's nothing but grounds for mischief and problems. And the third is allowing the technology to become so outdated. Punch cards started in the 1960s. They were the IBM punch cards, right? And now the only time anyone would ever see a punch card was when they went to vote. So here it was the year 2000, and you're handed this punch card, and people are like, what is this? Because it was about as outdated as a rotary phone. And so, you know, that election really showed how things can really get messed up. Now, the biggest reform that I think we've put into place and actually should be expanded upon is early voting. Because if we had had early voting in 2000, the ballot design issues could have bubbled up earlier, right? If you start early voting like now, it's going to start on October 19th. If on October 19th you go to the polls and there's something wrong with the ballot design, and this butterfly ballot could have been discovered earlier, then information can be spread to voters to explain how to avoid making a mistake on your ballot. Yeah. But back then we didn't have early voting. I think the greatest reform has been early voting. One, because you can discern problems earlier, but two, because our ballots in November particularly tend to be very long. We allow a whole lot of constitutional amendments. Sometimes they're pages long. If you live in a county where ballots have to be in both English and Spanish, they're very long. And expecting everyone to get their vote in on November the 3rd within a 12-hour period of time is really just not feasible in today's society. So I think the best reform has been early voting, and I encourage everyone listening to vote early and get your vote out of the way prior to Election Day.
And so on that vein, not only do people have the option of early voting, something else that has been talked about quite a bit lately is the mail-in ballot and I guess an absentee ballot. And so if you don't mind clarifying if those are one and the same, and about the I guess overall kind of safety, so to speak, of both the absentee ballot and the mail-in ballot, from your experience and then from what you've have learned, since your experience as supervisor of elections.
Yeah, there's nothing wrong with an absentee or mail-in ballot. And for everyone listening, if you're concerned, obviously you're concerned about the pandemic and you don't want to interact with that many people. And so asking for the ballot to come to your home, filling it out and sending it back makes perfect sense. A few things to consider. One is that your signature on the back of the ballot has to match the signature that's on file. Now, of course, the people checking this, they're not looking to deny your ballot. They want to accept your ballot. So they look at the signature. They're, it doesn't have to be, they're looking for, is this the right person or is this a forgery, right? And so, and during my time, it was rare that we would come across a signature where we couldn't say, yes, that is the person. But you do have to bear that in mind, because if you registered to vote back when you were 18 years old, and you're now in your 60s, and maybe you've become a busy executive and you have a certain way that you sign your name or something, or maybe you're a doctor and you don't sign that name like that anymore, then you do have to give pause for a moment and just make sure that your signature with the supervisor's office is what you want it to be. That's important. Again, canvassing boards and the staff, they want to count your ballot. They're not trying to deny your ballot. But still, if I had to choose between absentee ballot and voting in person, early voting any day of the week. It's less work for the supervisor's office. It's less labor intensive. When you vote early, whether you vote at the Amalie Arena, you can vote at Raymond James Stadium, you can vote at all these public libraries. You have 10 days before the election. When I went in for the primary, they had plexiglass and they had pens. I mean, they had it going on. They know what they're doing. They're doing their best to protect everyone. So, I would say if you're going to vote November 3rd, get your vote in early. Go to one of these voting places and vote early. Only take a few minutes. You put the vote in the ballot box. It's just like as if you voted on election day. If you vote absentee or by mail, just remember the thing about your signature. And you might want to call the supervisor's office to make sure that they received it, right? I mean, this is important. And so once you put it in the mail, there are also drop boxes where you can drop it off so you don't have to go through the mail. And so there'll probably be drop boxes at all these locations too.
Yeah, and that's an important point. You don't need to go and try and vote on November 3rd if you voted absentee. You can actually call or you can communicate otherwise. Because trying to vote after voting absentee or mail-in, that's not legal, and you can't do that.
We have Craig Latimer and his team, they do a really good job. We have good elections in the Tampa Bay area. Not just Hillsborough, but I would say Pinellas and Pasco. So, I think that you can count on the election process in the Tampa Bay area, but as you vote, get it out of the way early, be done with it, and do your part to make it easier on the elections office in general by getting it done early.
Well, I think that's a great way for us to end this. And we just really, really appreciate you spending the time with us, Pam. And, this is something that's a little different for us. Again, normally you would be here at the History Center. We'd have a nice crowd of people. And so doing it this way, this conversation will live on longer. And so we're excited about that part. And so for those who are out there watching this either live or watching this at later date, we really appreciate you tuning in. And please make sure you go to the website, the History Center, tampahistorycenter.org, see the other programming that we've already logged in. So we've got a great museum and home program. We've got some other things that we're doing now. So please check on that website and all the social media platforms to see what we're up to. And we are open, of course, and so you can come here and visit the center in person as usual. So once again, I really want to thank you, Pam, for joining us, and thank all of you out there for joining us as well.
I've enjoyed it. Thank you, Rodney. Take care.
You too. Thank you.